it's a little bit nerve-wracking, actually, to stand in front of an audience which has absolutely nothing to do with what I do in principle, except obviously I stay with you from time to time. And I have to be aware of the fact that I'm not totally competent in this area, but then most of us, when we think about what we do, we usually have a false impression of our own performance anyway. I really rather was taken by the fact that I work at Great Ormond Street, when I see that your companies have got much better names. We could have done better. Dragonfly, Custard, Perseus, Duetto, Puccini, and Leaf. But I did slightly worry about having to wear a badge that said Triptease when I get home. It's like Donald Trump. My job is weird in retrospect, but it is also wonderful because I operate on the hearts of small babies, and they are truly small. Now, I'm not going to show you much medical stuff, but I think there needs to be a bit of context here about what my job is. And I thought I'd show you something about scale, because otherwise it's all a bit meaningless. And this was a film made by my colleague Andrew Cook, and it looks at a newborn baby's heart. This is a newborn baby's heart. It is the size of a walnut. And for me, I have to operate on the inside of that. That is a heart that's 40 weeks when it's born, and that's a heart at 20 weeks. It's fully formed and working at 20 weeks in utero. That's how big it is. If we put a little pound coin by the side, you get some idea of the scale. It's working at 20 weeks, but it's also working at 14 weeks of gestation, and that's how big that is. And we are just beginning to work out techniques of operating on hearts of this scale, which are just the size of a grain of rice. That's a bit different from running a big hotel or running a big hospital. It took me 40-odd years to learn to do this, and I suddenly found myself on the board of a big company with zero training. Interesting experience. Now, it's not just that. Your organizations are complicated. We've heard that today from all the pressures that are going on. But mine is both complicated because of organizational reasons, and it's dangerous because of the environment in which we work. There are so many things that can go wrong in an area like this. And the baby, when I operate on it, is hidden away under a sheet, under toweling, and we're managing it fly-by-wire with lots of connections to electronic machinery where we're watching it remotely and having to understand this complex environment. This team has to function perfectly. Now, this is my colleague Luca Vricello, whose sound has gone again.
I think the perfect analogy is that of driving a car at 200 miles an hour on a single lane with water on either side. There's no room for error. And I think it's the most exhilarating.
Okay. Look, what Luca's saying is that you're driving along a road with water on either side as fast as you can go, and there's no room for error. And it's a ridiculous responsibility when it's one baby in there that you're very aware of and become friendly with. What's remarkable is how much better it's got over the last 50 years, which is the course of my working career is largely on here as well. That's the mortality. It was nearly 100% in 1950, and at Great Ormond Street last year it was 0.9%. So the measure that we used to use for success is now meaningless. And if you think about some of the metrics that we're going to talk about later in your industry and in mine, you have to think about the value of those metrics as they change over time. Now, I used to think that all of that improvement was due to the surgeon.
Gently, man, gently, you're not making bread. Don't forget, to be a successful surgeon, you need the eye of a hawk, the heart of a lion, and the hands of a lady.
And we all know the benefit of having small hands. Again, Mr. Trump has demonstrated that to us clearly. But we haven't got better because of the skills of the surgeon, because what we've done is to have to learn from all sorts of other things. We've had to be open to ideas from other industries. We've had to have a really dramatic pursuit of excellence. I'm going to concentrate a little bit more about the importance of data in this whole process. The surgery is only one tiny part of the process in making these children better. So the first place that we've learnt from are these people. Now, why on earth am I interested in cars that go around fast, crash into things, and quite remarkably survive crashes of 180, 190 miles an hour, as Fernando Alonso did here? I had the privilege of wearing his race suit after that, and he'd had one little tiny tear in one place, which is quite remarkable. Why Formula One? What's it got to do with my world of a baby in an intensive care unit? Why did we have any relationship with them at all? Well, we've actually learnt quite a lot from them. We've learnt about teamwork, safety for self-evident reasons, big data analytics, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I'm not going to talk about rapid prototyping, where we do huge amounts of product design and 3D printing, and logistics, which I will mention, but that's where we have to learn from. Just imagine, as I pass it by, they have to move all these teams from one place to another every week, and the race always starts on time. I can never get an operating list to start on time. Why not? So I have to learn that from them. The reason we got more closely engaged was because of Bristol. Is anybody old enough here to remember what happened in Bristol in the 80s and 90s? When the two surgeons on the extreme right of these movies had a high mortality than the rest of the country. And they were eventually, after a big inquiry, struck off. And the inquiry was managed by Ian Kennedy, who's a very good lawyer. And amongst 150 other things that he found and made recommendations about, he said the journey from the intensive care unit, from the operating room to the intensive care unit, was as dangerous or more dangerous than the operation itself, which was counterintuitive. How can it be that when you've finished one operation and you move that baby down a corridor to another place, that journey itself is dangerous? My predecessor at Great Ormond Street was extremely interested in human factors, why people like us run into trouble and babies suffer because we as humans make mistakes. And he thought that as a surgeon, maybe the babies were dying because he was drunk or having an argument with his wife, rather than a technical problem with the operation. And he did a brilliant study where he watched every operation of a particular type around the country over a 2-year period with Jane Carthy, who was a psychologist, and they watched how these operations were done and how the team behaved. And they found all sorts of things. It didn't really matter whether you were drunk, had been up all night, or had a row with your wife, because people were really focused. But what did matter was the journey from the operating room to the intensive care unit. That was replicated everywhere in the country. Now, the reason for this is that whenever you transfer a piece of information from one team to another team, bad things happen.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Überlebensradar.
Mayday, mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
It's self-evident that tiny linguistic error is not going to do you any good. Now, when we do this handover all the time, shift change, you do it from shift change in hotels, industry does it all the time, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. I'm going to show you one little piece of an operation. This is a thing called an arterial switch in a newborn baby. Those coronary arteries are 1 millimeter across, and I have to move them from one artery to another artery in an operation which takes about 7 hours. And I get quite tired. I have to learn how that baby works, and I have to do it with a team who work in the operating room. And this is a film taken a few years ago, so excuse the monitors. But we're working in this environment, and we're all learning how that baby works. If you think of it like a hotel, you're all learning how that customer behaves over the course of a week. You kind of know whether this child responds to a dose of blood or a particular drug or some fluid, and how it reacts. And at the end of that operation, I probably want to go to the pub because it's quite stressful. But I've got to disconnect the baby from all its monitoring, disconnect all these fine tubes and remove all their drugs, change it from an AC to a DC current, stick it on a cold trolley, wrap it up, move it down a corridor, and then hand it over to a team who, if it's 7:30 in the evening, will probably also be, rather than in the pub, than having to look after a sick baby overnight, because it's very stressful. And I have to tell them how that baby works, and they have to learn it, and we have to make some sort of plan. When you look at all that plumbing and all that information transfer and all of that changing emotion between our two teams, it's not really surprising that things go wrong, as they've found in Bristol. Well, one Sunday morning after I'd done a transplant and one of those switch operations on the Sunday morning, this came on the TV at lunchtime. It was the Spanish Grand Prix, and this is the McLaren pits in the days when they used to do refueling. And they did a pit stop in 6.8 seconds. And we looked at that and thought, well, it's the same. If they can do it, why can't we? So my colleague, a chap called Alan Goldman, who's from South Africa and therefore fearless, picked up the phone, phoned McLaren, and got put through to the pits in a way that I still find remarkable. And they were in our building on the Tuesday to discuss the question we'd raised. Now, why did we think it was the same? I mean, it's such a stupid idea. But that's a pit stop from above, and that's what happened when we transfer a baby from above. It's the same layout. Precious parcel in the middle, lots of information, and people scattered around the edge with jobs to do. And they have to get it right, because the driver's life depends on it, the prize money depends on it, and the same for us. Sid Watkins was the doctor who made Formula One safe, but we were lucky enough to have his son working on our intensive care unit, completely coincidentally, also called Sid. And Sid rang Sid and said, can you give us a hand and see if you can work with the McLaren guys to make this a safer process? And he sent Dave Ryan, Dave, who became known as Von Ryan, for obvious reasons in those days, Von Ryan's Express. And he came to see us. It was an interesting experience. He was very critical, but said we could solve a lot of the problems by just engineering out the problem, making a bed that was also an operating table that also had a power supply and a ventilator in it, and replace all the operating table beds and all the beds in the intensive care unit. And they could help us find a supplier, which was true. They could. They could make that thing, but of course I work for the health service, and they didn't supply a buyer. Nobody was going to replace all the beds in the hotel system in one night. So that was ruled out. So Sid put us into, we'd done some management work with Shell for other reasons, and Shell and Sid put us in touch with Ferrari. And Ross Brawn got very excited and said, this is a problem we can solve, and it's nothing to do with engineering. It's all about humans, all about human factors, which clearly fired up Mark and the rest of our team. And we were lucky enough to get a grant from a whole variety of people and hired Ken Catchpole, who's also an organizational psychologist. And we went to learn to do pit stops in Maranello, and they came to learn to move babies around at Great Ormond Street. And that was the start of a relationship with Formula One, which has gone on to this day. Nigel Stepney, who sadly died a couple of years ago, was the first person from Ferrari to visit us, and that was humiliating. He thought we were a bunch of tossers. We had absolutely zero organization around this process, even though we'd now learned that it was dangerous. And most importantly of all, he had absolutely no idea whose job it was. And frankly, neither did I. And we spent a lot of time working with them, most importantly around a round table. If you have a square table, somebody always takes charge. For some reason or other, somebody sits at the end and pretends to be chairman. On a round table, it's a much more easy way of sharing that leadership out. We mapped the process, which we'd never done. we imagined what could go wrong instead of assuming what could go right, which was the way we were thinking at the time. It's only moving a baby, it's going to be okay. We made a plan of what we would do if something did go wrong, and we mentally rehearsed it over and over again, with the Formula One guys. Our process map was 10 times more complicated than a pit stop, because it's more complicated. And they were really anxious to get it right. The things we changed, I'm just going to run through very quickly, because there's more to it, of course. But these topics, I think, are completely relevant in every time where you have a shift change or you're handing information from one team to another. The first is leadership. In a pit stop, there's a lollipop man who basically controls the whole lot. It's done electronically these days with red and green lights, but they're in control. In our business, nobody knew who was in charge, and we actually allocated that job to the anaesthetist until the baby was in the intensive care suite, and then it made a formal transition to the intensivists who were in charge. The sequence in a pit stop is absolutely crystal clear. You've seen this every Sunday when you watch a race. Everybody has a rhythm and a defined order of doing things, and the more beautiful, the quicker it becomes. Ours was completely inconsequential and inconsistent. Where do you think the worst place to have a cardiac arrest is? In a room full of doctors, because we're all trained to help. So we'll rush to you and help you, but we'll probably crush you in the process, because it's very difficult to get one person to take charge under those circumstances and to do their specific job. So this is very important. What they did was make logical phases, get the equipment and technology plumbed in, then transfer the information, and only then talk about it and make a plan. Do not interfere with the mechanics of the process. And everybody was given a specific job. We'd been erratic, and then we weren't. So everybody had a task. We had this 40-page document, but we didn't know what the risks were. We'd never measured the risk. And they taught us to use a technique which you probably all use in hotels all the time, called failure modes and effect analysis. Anybody familiar with that? So you've got they have £100 million to spend, but of course it's never enough. We had £10 to spend, and that wasn't enough either. So you have to make a sum up which gives you some clue as to how to distribute the money. How severe would it be if the wheel came off, or if I didn't transfer the information about adrenaline? What's the likelihood of the wheel coming off? And if it did come off, would I be able to detect it before it came off so that I could do something about it? If you score each one of those as a risk, say 10 by 10 by 10, you end up with a thing called a risk priority number, and you can make a matrix which tells you what are the top things you should look at. It's so simple. I mean, there's lots of risk scores in business, I know, but this was the easiest one for this job. We'd never done one, and we ended up applying this and had a 42-page document of risks that we didn't really know existed, each of which had a score and has been chipped away at ever since over the last decade. Have you heard the term situational awareness? So if anybody's ever done any pilot training, this is part of your business. It's as when you're sitting on a flight deck and your weather changes, but you spend all your time looking at a single gauge on the screen, looking at tire pressure or something, you're not aware of the fact that you're going into a thunderstorm. You lose the situational awareness. And in a pit stop, someone has to watch the big picture. It's the same guy who's leading it. And we had to make that role allocated as well. They practice and practice and practice. We had never practiced. We did it every day, but we'd never practiced until we got it to be good. And now we do. And we train all our staff on it regularly, a standard operating procedure which are almost unheard of in medicine. And we had to debrief and review. We still don't do that very well, but we analyze the data better. It worked, and after we did a 2-year study longitudinally that ended up with a huge reduction in multiple errors, and we changed to be a closer, stronger, and more effective team. And this has now spread everywhere, this technique, everywhere in medicine, every shift change, every intensive care unit, every cardiac unit around the world. But at the time, we couldn't publish it. You know, as an academic life, you have to get it into a scientific journal, and that's how you get your brownie points if you're a professor like me. And we ended up getting it into a Mickey Mouse journal called Pediatric Anesthesia, which has a readership of about 6. And it took us a long time to get it published. But Alan and I were invited to give a talk about it in New York. And there was a journalist from the Wall Street Journal at the back. 3 weeks later, it was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and we had a readership of 80 million, which still doesn't reach my scoring system in the university, but meant we were invited into companies to talk about how to control the dangers at shift change. Because in America, they were finding that manufacturing processes were collapsing every time the shift changed. The standard operating procedures weren't robust enough. Service industries had the same problem in the morning and the evening. And this simple process that Formula One had been doing for years suddenly started to have legs. And of course, we taught them some stuff. You know, you can't live with somebody like that for very long, and we taught them some things that could be useful when they went home to their families. So, just simply getting the nappy right. And also, we have a big program of ultrasound scanning of women during pregnancy, and that allowed us to work some early talent discovery for them as well. And it worked until this year. I don't know what's happened to him. So that was the first thing. It was about teamwork, about recognizing that we needed rules to function as a team, and that the things you took for granted when you were transferring information between one team and another were actually not working, and we smugly assumed they were. And if you look inside your organization, things that feel as though they should be working well probably aren't, because you don't look at them in sufficient detail. The other area that we've worked with a lot, and increasingly now, is about data. In a Formula One car, it has had a massive increase in the number of sensors that are embedded in it. It used to be 150 2 or 3 years ago. Now there's thousands. They get over 430 terabytes of data from the teams when they go around a 2-hour race, sent back to the factories in real time to redesign the car and to monitor and to develop strategy and tactics. But what you see on a screen is a bunch of wiggly lines, like this. Lots of squiggly lines. And they use those to identify and predict engine failure or component failure, but also to help them define tactics and strategy, when to change the tires, when to refuel, and so on. And this is what we see on a baby in the intensive care unit. Bunch of squiggly lines that look exactly the same, really, as the squiggly lines coming from a Formula One car. This child has a cardiac arrest out here. If we had been able to use the same mathematics that they do, wouldn't it be nice to learn what to do to stop this happening? And that's exactly what we've done. Now, we're working with 2 groups of people. In Birmingham and one other hospital in the UK, we're working with McLaren to use a technique called principal component analysis, which plots data out in 3 dimensions. So blood pressure, pulse, heart rate, a couple of things like that. And you get a cloud of normal data over here, and when something starts to go wrong, the data move over here, changing from green to red. You have to teach it that. It doesn't know what good is or what bad is. But as we intervene, the computers learn what we did and what worked and got it back to the green area. And we're meshing hospitals all over the world with this, so that the computers are now giving us automatic machine learning, a very complex environment, to help us with decision support and tactical and strategic advice. We're working with Boston and Toronto and NASA on exactly the same project, just using a different set of software. It's what you needed to want to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. It's the same sums. What could go wrong? And the principle actually is all about data. And this little slide across the bottom could work for business. It could work for home. It could work for what Google needs to do next. It works really well as a model. We'll get the data, make sure you're getting it from a good place, add insight, and use it to guide the strategy of whatever you're doing. There's nothing wrong with that line. The second thing that changed over the last 25 years or so is that we've had a completely relentless pursuit of excellence. We heard a little bit about that in the panel. And I think this say nobody jumps higher if you lower the bar. Now, this is psychologically a very important thing, especially in medicine. Doctors particularly have had to compete all the way through their lives. Compete at school, compete to get into medical school, compete to pass the exams, compete to get a job, and they are competitive people. And if you keep raising the bar, they will jump it. And to do that, you need to have an understanding of how to use benchmarked information to get the best out of people. And I think this is where we've got into a terrible argument with newspapers like the Daily Mail about league tables, where they concentrate on what's on the bottom and on the average. Now, if that's the national average, and this is my hospital, the instinct is to feel very pleased because you're doing better than national average. But statistically, you will always revert to the mean unless you do something more sophisticated. What really matters is to know who or what is best in class. So as far as I'm concerned, I only want to know my performance and best in class, because if somebody else can do it better, that's a bridgeable gap. I should be able to find a way of reaching that height. And so being better than average isn't really good enough. And to understand how to make that leap, you've got to have information which tells you how everybody else is doing. So your metrics have to be performance sensitive, visible, and rational. Now, I've just stayed in 2 hotels, one in Leeds and one in Granada in Spain. And I had a terrible experience in Leeds and a fantastic experience in Granada. Same number of stars, same problems, bad maintenance in the rooms, and the resolution of that problem was utterly different. It was utterly different because of people, but every metric I could read about those hotels told me they were equal. Everything I could read as a customer about these hotels made it look good. The Leeds one was rubbish, and the Granada one was fantastic. And it was only about people. Does anybody know this guy? You should, because his name is Arthur Gillies. He's the CEO of Protea Hotels in South Africa. They've won customer service prizes for years. And Arthur is a fantastic speaker and very entertaining. You can see him speak at that website. And he said, I suppose you think I'm going to tell you that the customer is always right. In my experience, the customer is usually wrong. In fact, almost every time, the customer is a pain in the ass. But the customer is always the customer. And if the customer doesn't come back, you have no fucking business. To me, that really sums it up absolutely. You don't like these people, necessarily. You don't have to like them, but you have to give them what they want. You have to do it well. And I wasn't given that good treatment at the desk in Leeds, and I was in Granada, and they sorted the problem out instantly. I can't do that in my hospital, by the way. In my hospital, functions like Leeds, because we don't have a concierge culture, which is what makes great hotels great, is that there's never a delay in getting anything done. You don't have to say, I'll ask my supervisor. You don't hear that as a customer. Somebody solves the problem for you. The Wi-Fi works, the tap doesn't drip, the light is replaced. Now, sadly, unless you're somebody like Arthur Gillies, people don't always do what you want them to do. And their heart, no matter how much pressure you put on them, their hearts and minds don't necessarily follow. You cannot force people to do what they don't want to do. And that goes back a long way. I love this equation. It comes from a psychologist called Leuven, who said that the behavior of a person is a function of the person and their environment, or their company, or the hotel in which they work, or their hospital. So you can't solve a problem by being tough on the person if you don't also solve the environment that they're working in. We heard that in the panel just now. We have to concentrate on delivering really good environment for our staff if we want to keep them. Let me explain that a bit more. And this is from Ken Catchpole, that organizational psychologist. This is any of us, one of us in the middle. And you think of yourself as liveware. You've got your own physical attributes. You've got what you know. You've got your own attitudes, your own cultures, and your own stresses. I was up all night last night because my son was the victim of an armed robbery. And so we spent the whole night with the Metropolitan Police, who deserve a shout-out for having great customer service, by the way, last night. But those are my stresses standing up here, which you don't know about. The thing is, you've got your own stresses, and I have to work with you. It's a slightly remote relationship, but if we were working in a close team, this could be me. You've got your own stresses, and I've now got some new added problems in relating to you. Teamwork, communication, leadership, other norms like that. And then there's all the stuff that are kept in the office downstairs, the software, the procedures, and the manuals that you're supposed to know, you read once and now you've forgotten. I suspect some of you may have forgotten the manuals, particularly for the bigger corporates who've got big manuals. Like me, you also have to work with the new hardware and technology and equipment. The Wi-Fi doesn't work, and you can't get the connection you want, and everything's dependent on the new database, which just broke down, and the guy's on holiday who knows how to fix it. And then the money changes, we get Brexit, we have Lansley, which is our Brexit, and everything goes pear-shaped. All of these interfaces, just like the interfaces between shifts, can fail, every single one of them. And you have to concentrate on managing those interfaces and not the individual. Now, I looked at HotStats before I came here and looked at what your payroll costs were over the last few years. And this is what was published in 2016. Look at my payroll costs as a proportion of business. 60 to 70% of Great Ormond Street's stuff goes on people. And that means that we have doubled or tripled the number of interfaces that we have to deal with compared to you. It is complex. Fortunately, in every environment, teams form organically to solve these problems of interfaces. And some of you may have seen this before. If you have, leave it to the others.
Rien du feu?
Oui, j'ai le feu. Vous me l'amenez, s'il vous plaît.
Excusez-moi, vous pourriez la tenir une minute?
Bien sûr.
Désolé, j'ai fini.
Oh, c'est bon, allez, je vous charge.
J'ai terminé.
Moi aussi.
I'm not sure all the women in here will get that, but the problem is solved because people are helping each other. And that's the natural human instinct. If you allow people to solve the problem locally, that's often better than imposing a solution on them. You can put that another way. This is a lovely Banksy drawing from a door in London. And I think if you convert that to this mixture of performance and data and how people work together, this is quite a good definition of how a good team functions. So it's a continuous cycle of learning more about each other, rehearsing, planning, and acting and doing, just like we did with Formula One. There's another circle that's critical in my business, and that is the basic values. We heard a little bit from Stephen about the basic values in Hilton. The values of an organization, the values for me, are always something that drive our behavior. For us, it's about safety, never doing any harm, getting a good experience for the patient, and most of all, doing it well to get good outcomes for those patients. To do that, I have to tell the truth to myself, to my colleagues, and to the patients. If I don't tell the truth, we don't have trust. And if we don't have trust, then in my case, I have no business, and I rather suspect it's the same for you. If you lose the trust of your customers, the business goes somewhere else. Trust is what it's all about. And I think what builds that trust in the modern era, and it's changed, isn't a nice smiling doctor with a good bedside manner. It's the data that underlies that. I'm getting old enough now where I might someday soon have a prostate problem and need an operation. It is currently impossible for me to go to a website in this country and find out where to go, because it'll tell you how good somebody is at taking a kidney tumor out, dealing with a bladder problem, but it won't tell me what my percentage risk of incontinence or impotence is if I have my prostate operation. That's unacceptable. I think data isn't just about that public side of it, but we use it to improve behavior of our teams. And we need to find measures that matter. And this is one of my favorite graphs, because it says basically everything there is to know about data. Some stuff happens on one side, and some other stuff happens at a different frequency there. And you end up with a change, which I used to be an editor of a journal, and my co-editor used to write on the bottom of the papers that he reviewed, SFW. So fucking what? Because he got all the way through this paper, something changed, something else changed. It was like mother's milk. It didn't actually matter. So you have to understand what the data are telling you with insight. And there is one equation which I think would equate across most of business. It's from Michael Porter, the professor of economics at Harvard Business School, which is that value equals outcome divided by cost. All of you who've done a business course will know that equation. But he is focusing here on one thing in healthcare, that the only value that matters is the value to the patient, not to the doctor, not to the nurse, not to the hospital, not to the hotel, but to the customer. And it's the value over life, health outcome over life, divided by the cost over life. So if I operate on a baby at 2 months of age and do a great job, I get a big reward for that family and a big reward for me and a big reward for society because they'll pay tax. If I do a very successful cardiac operation but damage their brain, I've ruined their life and added cost. And it's not measured beyond 30 days or 90 days because I'm thinking of my hospital. So for the data to be useful, they need to follow these rules. And this is really critical if you're doing the data. The data have to be valid and complete. It's no good having missing data. They need to be well analyzed and well presented. Otherwise, you and I wouldn't understand them. I have other biases for my specialty, and I think I could possibly make a good argument for yours as well, that the data should be public. That would drive up quality. I think they should be explorable by other companies and other people. That would drive up quality. And I think they should be relevant to the customer, because that will clearly make them see what was happening. You have to ask what they're for. So in most businesses, the metrics feed the need to get shareholder benefit. The board has to be satisfied that those metrics are demonstrating whatever variables you choose to demonstrate corporate performance. The CEO's career is dependent on those metrics. There's a local lead lower down whose annual objectives are going to be judged by those metrics. And the shop floor worker may also have some objectives which they sort of vaguely have some clue are important to the organization, but probably not. And what about the customer in all this? What are they seeing of your metrics? Let's turn it around. These are 14 of the metrics that you currently published. I've drawn them from a variety of websites. I don't know if I must have missed some out. There were so many. And you've got nearly as many as acronyms as I have in my job. I was very pleased. But how many of those have anything to do with the customer? Sentiment score on TripAdvisor and possibly website conversion rate. And these are the biggest ones that I can see out there when I look at hotel performance as a customer. This is what you talk about. Now, there may be net changes which tell me whether these are good things about hotels or not, but as a customer, I'm not sure. You could argue that you might want to turn them around because at the end of all this, what really matters is that the customer is satisfied. Yeah? And that matters because of something that Saul Klein, who's a friend of mine who invested very heavily in Facebook when it started and doesn't need to work anymore. And he invests in companies to the tune of billions. And he has one basically simple rule about how to invest in a company. He said, if they're not measuring data which is relevant to the customer, I'm not going to bother. Because if it's right for the customer, then it's going to be right for the board, it's going to be right for the shareholders, it's going to be right for everybody else. Now, I have no business experience other than Great Ormond Street. I don't know whether that's right. But it has a ring of truth to me. And if you take a balanced scorecard approach, which you probably all remember from Kaplan and Norton's work in the 90s, we all use balanced scorecards at board level. They're loved by management, in my experience, and they have absolutely zero power on the shop floor to make anything change. Nobody who reads them on the shop floor, a surgeon, a nurse, takes any notice of the balanced scorecard. And when you look at what's on the balanced scorecard in the hotel industry, the ones that I looked at were 75% dominated in the customer box by financial measures. They should be linking to strategy in some way. Have you seen this quote before? I love this quote. If you don't know where you're going, any direction suits you. It's a very good way of describing strategy. And there's been just a very good review in one of your journals looking at whether or not balanced scorecards make any difference to this. And over the last decade or so, there has been a change in the frequency with which these things are recorded and the accuracy with which recorded. There's been a growth in innovation and learning, and all the others have stayed pretty much the same. And there is often, on the balanced scorecards used in the hotel industry, according to these people, a poor link with strategy. I leave you to debate that. Another journal, again, said we're maybe focusing too much on the finance and not enough on the training of staff, making the staff, oh, we just heard it again today, that would be a really cool thing to do. And again, they pointed out that the customer is barely recorded the things that are important. It's customer satisfaction is one part of that review, when the rest were all about RevPAR prices and occupancy, which are more financial, I'd say. So how do I compare that with what we do? So we set out some goals for our organization which were built around the customer. We wanted to provide the best outcomes at the lowest cost, have satisfied families, have a constant focus on innovation because that's what we like to do. We wanted to be the training center of choice in Europe. And we wanted our teams to be able to demonstrate pure collaboration across the site and with other countries. And we wanted all our data to be transparent. And we had to develop some new tools. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but that mortality graph gets criticized a lot because our patients, our customers, are more difficult than your customers. It's a classic doctor saying, oh, well, we have a high mortality because our patients are more difficult. So what happens in this is looking at mortality. If you have a survivor of an operation, that line goes up a little bit. If it's a big operation, it goes up a bit more. If you die from a big operation, your line drops a bit. If you die from a simple operation, it drops a lot more. So it's a snakes and ladders effect. And this was Great Ormond Street's survival graph against the national average, which is plotted as 0 on this line for last year. We thought that's a very, very good performance. All it does is tell you you've got a good performance in relation to the average. I still don't know if we're best or not. Actually, these are the best, but I can't show you that on this graph. That's public. It's public for everyone to see on the web. It's public. My name and my graph that looks like that goes in the Daily Grope every April. It's absolutely transparent. But internally, that doesn't turn the worker on. This turns the worker on because it's a different way of showing the same data. Along the bottom is just a sequence number, patient by patient by patient. It's not time. Along the vertical axis is each death. And each time you go along, it goes along a little bit and then rises. So if you look at 2014-15, there's an area in the middle where there are hardly any deaths. Lots of straight lines. That's a cluster of success. And before it, here is a cluster of failure. Both the success and the failure warrant investigation, asking the question, why did we do so badly or why did we do so well? Because that is what makes change. I don't need to do any management on this graph because the people do it. They look at it and they say, well, what can we do to make it better? And often I don't know what they did, but they just get better and better and better. It's a way of avoiding too much management. Highly reliable organizations like the nuclear industry, flight decks, are obsessed by failure, but they don't blame each other when things go wrong, which is very unlike medicine, and I don't know what it's like in the hotel industry. Is there a lot of blame around? Blame is absolutely terrible if you want to investigate a cluster of success or a cluster of failure, because the very people who get blamed know the answer. And if you suspend them or fire them, you don't have their cooperation. They need to use them to learn. The airline industry have taught us that really well. They never sack a pilot for crashing a plane until they've had a full investigation. And very rarely then. They'd rather retrain than lose the asset. So what and where are your negative outcomes as hoteliers? Where do I look up and see what your complaint rate is for a particular hotel chain? Where do I find that on the web? Is it accurate? What are the other negative? How many critical incidents, whatever you decide to call them, do you have in your individual hotel? Is the Hilton safer than for somewhere else? Is it better than somewhere else? How do I know? Somebody has looked at this, and they couldn't find any negative outcomes in the hotel published data that were similar across the literature. So everybody was reporting something different and not very well. For us, this is another driver to get better. So we decided that having to go back to the operating room for bleeding was a bad thing, a failure. So we now publish this as well, by name. And look what's happened. We don't know why it's got better. I don't actually care, except that it's being reproducible. And now, where that long period of time happened, we do have an understanding of why it's got better, and now it's a rule. And this single graph has turned out to be one of our best drivers, because 150 patients at Great Ormond Street last year cost us almost 50% of the budget. The patients with the most complications. And wouldn't it be better if we concentrated on not having complications rather than trying to find success? Concentrate on failures, identify it earlier and put it right. And we set an arbitrary rate of, at the beginning of the year, of 85% would be good. And we hit it almost immediately. And this SPC chart has stayed like that. And just this last few months, it's now gone up to 90% complication-free. We do customer surveys. Everybody likes us at Great Ormond Street, but they're done after the event, when your customer leaves. They're not in real time. If you want to know what your customers feel like, we should be collecting data in real time. Those places that use Twitter well or other social media will know better immediately, and we don't do that in hospitals because it's not regular. And we also have an annual regulator review, which is like the police coming around, and that means that we're on our toes, but it's spurious. It's not looking at the raw data. I think that what I wanted to get over to you today was that if you want to get better, you have to be open-minded and learn from other industries. There is absolutely no point in not being self-critical, and being smug is the enemy of excellence, I think. All of our improvements are data-driven. What's made it possible to see faster acceleration of that is to making those data available to the entire team in the hospital, which we do every week, as you saw, and ever increasingly to the public once we know the data are valid. We've created a just and no-blame culture, and we are dependent on leadership from somebody. Now, I don't know what leadership's like in the hotel industry, but in the university department, there are basically three models. So you could have the chain model, where the professor is the final link of the chain that holds that department to the wall of knowledge. And everybody kind of shares in that experience. Or you could have a pyramid where nobody's allowed to speak to the professor until they've cleared it with the next layer down, much more common. And there's the mushroom principle, which is where you keep your staff in the dark and then just sprinkle them with shit from time to time. I come from having grew up in the latter category, I must say. But whatever it is as a role model, as a leader, whatever level of the organization you are, you're a role model for somebody just below you. So that model of leadership that you choose will rapidly become the culture unless you maintain the role modeling at a higher level in the organization. So I'm a cardiac surgeon, and obviously I've nearly finished now, but I'm never wrong as a matter of principle. But we do have some problems. And I just wanted to finish with something that I would like your organizations to help me with. And that is that you've talked about occupancy and revenue per occupied room and so on. But in my business, I'm at Great Ormond Street, we run at very, very high occupancy levels because we have to. And with various mathematical modeling systems that you use in queuing theory, it's very difficult to identify what the safe, for my case, safe, your case, effective occupancy rate is. There are many factors which make that work. What I can say in my business is the higher intensity care, the sicker the baby. The closer you get to 100% occupancy, the greater the risk. And Great Ormond Street, Birmingham Children's, Newcastle, Bristol are running between 95 and 105% occupancy all the time. This is unsustainable. And so our Brexit problem has been coming for 10 years because this last government has decided to reduce the proportion of the state's income that goes to healthcare. And these babies keep getting on sick, and they're being born at a greater rate because the birth rate's going up. So we've got unlimited demand, an excellent service with great results, and if I was a business, I'd be building like mad. And I'm stopped from doing just that. This is a man called William Douglas, who's an American juror, who said this: sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think that goes for the transparency of data. The more you see, the more you share, the better people do, the more honest they are between themselves, because truth equals trust. Now, I showed you the picture of the waves at the beginning, and I have to be very careful because do you know what the most common cause of death is amongst cardiac surgeons? Drowning. Because by the time they realize that they can't walk on water, they still can't stop speaking. So I think it's time for me to finish and say thank you very much for having me here. I hope that a little bit of the overlap between our industries has been interesting, and thank you once again for being here.